Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan Fisher. Everyone seems to agree that the old ways of selling B2B simply don't work like they used to. But few thought leaders have as much clarity on how to fix the problem as today's guest, Andy Paul. Andy is the best-selling author. He is the host of the Sales Enablement podcast, and he's the founder and principal of the Sales Action Group. In our conversation today, we'll discover a precise and road-tested framework you and your team can use to reject the outdated sales methods your buyers hate, take control of how you sell, be your authentic self, and blow your former sales results out of the water. Andy Paul, great to have you on the show today.
Jonathan, thanks for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. So you've had a lot to say. I mean, if someone explores your world, you actually have a ton of IP in addition to the book. So we're going to be definitely narrowing our focus today, but I'm going to put that out there for the listener. I mean, you have a world to explore, but we have a very specific framework we're going to get into today that you do cover in your book. And I'm just wondering, how did you arrive at the insights that you're going to be sharing with the audience today?
Personal experience, both selling myself as well as working with clients over 22-year period, sales teams of all sizes, and just looking at the results people are experiencing and the trends that are happening in this industry, and came to the conclusion as I started to sit down and write this third book, knowing somewhat what I wanted to write, but it's just like, why do we seem to we've gotten worse at selling over the last 10 to 15 years? When we're really in the sort of golden age, we've got all the sales technology to support us, and why aren't we able to use these tools to be better? And so that was really the question I was trying to answer. And yeah, saw, and we all see constantly that the way that sellers are perceived by buyers is often very negative, and it's for a reason, which is it's largely how we enable and train sellers to act. And thought, okay, there's a better way to do it. So that's what the book is about.
Well, and I've seen multiple studies that indicate that there is a large portion of whatever you're in, whatever your market is, a lot of your buyers really don't even want to talk to you, right? There's definitely a thing out there about salespeople. What do you think that's rooted in, by the way?
Well, because salespeople don't provide any value, don't provide a return on investment. If you look at the buyer saying, look, I'm going to invest my time, my attention, my resources in you, they're not getting a return on that investment in time, attention, and resources. So why do they want to spend time with the seller? It's the sellers show up with their own interests first and foremost in mind, and not they're really prepared to help the buyer do what they're trying to do, which is make progress toward making a decision.
Well, and that's really the key role of a sales professional, is to help people make a good decision. Humans are typically not fantastic at making decisions, especially when there seems to be interests that are conflicting. Would you agree with that? And do you think that is that one of the gaps? What are some of the gaps you think in terms of the disconnect between? You got a lot of people that are in sales. That's the other thing you can look at. Look at studies, and a lot of folks in our country today are in sales jobs. That's a huge portion of our workforce, something 30% plus. So what is that disconnect in a nutshell, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think 30% of people are in sales. I mean, the single largest profession in the United States actually is truck driver. But there's a lot of people whose job it is, as Daniel Pink wrote in his book, To Sell Is Human, whose job it is to influence other people, work through other people, which is what sellers do. And the big disconnect, I think, is that we train sellers fundamentally, their job is one of persuasion, right? Your job is to go out and persuade somebody to buy your product or service. And there's a couple problems with that. One is that, as shown in research that Jonah Berger wrote in his book, The Catalyst, that human beings universally react negatively to attempts to persuade them. They call it persuasion reactance. 100%. It's a universal trait of humans. So it's sort of ironic that we spend billions of dollars a year in sales training, fundamentally trying to train sellers how to become more persuasive, which is a trait that people instinctively resist. And so I try to frame that, there's another way to do that, which is, because persuasion is all about trying to get what you want, instead of being sort of sales centric, it's being more buyer centric, which is your job as a seller really is to listen to your buyer, understand the things that are truly most important to them in terms of the problems they're trying to solve and the outcomes they want to achieve by solving them, and then helping them achieve those things. And that's a completely different way of looking at it. And it's that framework that enables you as a seller to create an experience for the buyer during their buying process that sets you apart from other sellers.
Well, right on, and I think that there's a lot to be said about what is the buyer's experience, right? That's all the buzz when it comes to differentiating yourself in the tech sector, even from the standpoint of your product, how people encounter you online. It's true in terms of human interactions as well. People,
Absolutely.
there's a lot that people do that are kind of just some bad habits. So,
Well, but look at the context of this is that in so many marketplaces these days, so many spaces in the market. We can choose an example out of the software world. Let's say, conversational intelligence. An example I used before is, I don't know, 3, 4 years ago, maybe there was half a dozen companies that were doing it. 3 years ago, there was a dozen. 2 years ago, there's 2 dozen. A year ago, there's, I think, 40 companies I counted. There's probably more today. So if you're a buyer and you're in that situation where you're looking for a solution, let's say in the conversational intelligence space, how do you choose?
hmm,
Because from their perspective, well, they all largely do the same thing and they all are priced pretty much the same.
hmm,
How do you make a decision? Well, what Gartner showed, or the gentleman, yeah, Brett and Matt, that wrote the Challenger sale, referencing Gartner research, said is that, well, hey, what we found in our research is that 53% of the buyer's purchase decision is based upon their experience with the individual seller.
hmm.
So the number one factor influencing the decision is that experience with the seller. And there's been subsequent research that's done with companies that do heavy win-loss analyses that said, or found, there's a company in Australia, Trinity Perspectives, run by a gentleman, Kean McLaughlin. They've done extensive win-loss analyses with enterprises over the last dozen years. And they published a sort of summary of 9 reasons why you win big deals and 9 reasons why you lose big deals. And of those 18 reasons, nothing had to do with the product or the
Hmm.
functionality
Hmm.
or the price. Well, the one mentioned about price was the product was too cheap. But in general, these 18 reasons why you win and lose were all based on the human experience that they had with you as a seller. And people just want to ignore that and say, no, no, we're all process driven. It's all about the metrics. It's purely a numbers game, which undoubtedly sales is at some point always a numbers game. But people are making decisions based on their experience with other human beings.
Well, that's a really powerful statement because identifying the problem allows us to offer a real solution. And
Hmm.
I think we need to deliver on the promise I made. I think you've got real clarity on how to fix this problem. I fully agree with your analysis. How do we begin? What are the stages and steps we can take a look at to begin to formulate a solution to this and build a better user experience from the human standpoint?
Well, it starts with sellers taking the control of how they sell. Right? We operate within processes, we operate within frameworks, but fundamentally, your job is to your responsibility, let's say, as an individual professional, is to become the best version of you that you can be.
Hmm.
And yeah, I like to sort of, when I look at sort of a salesperson, let's say, they sort of divide into two parts, right? There's your product knowledge, there's your knowledge about your process, your methodology, and so on. There's things that we get trained on routinely, right? All necessary. But there's a missing piece, which is, as I said, we're good at training humans how to be sellers. Are we doing a good job of training sellers how to be human?
Hmm.
Because it's that human that makes the difference ultimately in the mind of the buyer.
Hmm.
And so that's what I talked about in the 4 pillars of selling in. If you're not selling out, you're selling in, based on these innate human attributes: connection, curiosity, understanding, generosity, that enable you to connect with the buyer, build the credibility and trust you need to be able to ask the questions that go a little bit deeper to enable you to get the answers perhaps you weren't going to normally get if you're just doing sort of your standard drive-by discovery that most sellers do. Um, where you can get to the point where you have reached this deep understanding what's truly most important to the buyer. Because if you can reach that level where the buyer really feels understood, well, that has tremendous value for them in terms of making their decision. And then generosity is about, yeah, how do you provide the value in a way that helps the customer do what they want to do, which is to quickly gather and make sense of the information they need to make an informed decision with the least investment of their time, attention, and resources possible.
So you've given us a really good framework. Let's dive a little bit deeper if we could. If you could start by defining terms, selling out versus selling in.
Selling
What do you
in.
mean when you talk about that?
Well, selling out is, as a seller, putting your own interest ahead of those of the buyer. And so this is when you show up and throw up, when you show up, pitch, 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 pitch. If you think that your job as a seller is purely to persuade the buyer to buy your product or service, I mean, think about that. If
Hmm.
you have that black and white, if your job is really just, I'm here to persuade you, then uh, understanding what's, your needs, your requirements, things that are really important to you would really sort of secondary, because it's almost immaterial, because I'm here to persuade you to buy my product. And we have this mismatch all the time, is because in the early part of their buying process, the buyer, and I think this is a confusion point for many sellers, and I think unfortunately, because some analyst reports sort of have muddied the waters. People hear this all the time. Oh, the buyers 70% of the way through their buying process before they talk to sellers for the first time. It's not true, right? And maybe in a real transactional product, perhaps it is, but anything with any sort of complexity, part of the reason your sellers need to talk, or excuse me, the buyers need to talk to sellers, is they need your help to better define and understand the problems that they think they have and the outcomes they can achieve by addressing them. I mean, if this is a role of sellers, is to help your buyers more fully understand the scope of the challenges they have
Hmm.
and the scope of the opportunities.
Hmm.
And so if you go into it thinking, oh, well, they know exactly what they want, they know exactly what they need, they fully understand the landscape out there. Yeah, you're just a transactional sale at that point.
Hmm.
Sell on price and features.
Do you think it's fair to say that part of the issue is maybe defining one's role in sales? There's a mismatch there. That's kind of what I'm hearing you say. And tell me if I'm right. It's
Yeah.
almost like most sales professionals seem to feel that it's their job is to create an outcome. Where you're saying no, it's actually to play a role, and that role is one of service. Would you agree with that? Is that a fair way to summarize?
In general, yeah. Yeah. I mean, sales is a service profession. I mean, there's all this research right now that's come out that said, look, buyers don't want to talk to sellers. And I think that's just half answer or partial answer. The real answer is they don't want to talk with sellers that can't help them get their job done,
Hmm.
right? They can't help them better understand the nature of what they're trying to accomplish. They can't help them make a better and informed decision. And so if you're showing up purely as a sort of self-interested, self-motivated seller, putting your interest ahead of the buyers, then they don't have time for you. They don't want to talk to you because you're not helping them.
Hmm.
But self-aware buyers know that we need people from the outside that can ask the questions that we don't think to ask ourselves. Right? There's a whole body of research around this concept of strong ties and weak ties.
Hmm.
Right? And so when people within an organization develop strong ties, what happens is they all start knowing the same information, or what the sociologists call redundant information. And so when it comes time to contemplate making a change in the way they're doing one thing or another within their business and to achieve something else, the self-aware organization knows that they need to be able to talk to people, like I said, who they have weak ties with, who know things that they don't know, who know what questions to ask them that they don't know to ask themselves. This is why buyers need to talk to sellers. They don't want to talk to sellers. I mean, I don't think I've had great relationships with my customers over decades. I don't think any one of them ever wakes up in the morning and says, "Gosh, I hope Andy calls me." They don't want to talk to salespeople, but they know they need to. But the problem is there's this disconnect because they have a hard time finding sellers who can help them do just what I talked about. And so, you start with these sort of, basic human attributes. We're all wired to connect with other human beings. We have that need to do it. Our buyers want the connection. I know there are voices out there in the sales world saying, "Oh, buyers don't want the connection." That's just wrong. They do. They're human beings. That's an important thing. Uh, they want to work with you, and they want, to have this build this credibility and trust bond with you because it helps them in their process that they're going through, and it's part of the experience they have of you. And it's a necessary step. I mean, if you want to truly get to the point where the buyer opens up to you, shares information with you that they don't willingly share with every seller that crosses, that they talk to or that comes into their office or whatever. Has to be built on a level of trust that exists. Um, when that trust exists, then you can start using your curiosity, not to ask your standard discovery questions, but to ask questions that cause the buyer to think differently about the problems they think they're
Hmm.
facing and the outcomes they can achieve.
Hmm.
I mean, if you're not able to go and have them think differently about it, again, someone else has shaped their vision of what success looks like,
Hmm.
and you're just trying to compete on what functions and price at that point.
Yeah. So the alternative that you proffer is selling in, and you gave us a four-part framework to that. Let's dive into those each one if we could. So begin with the first one. How do we begin to be specialists in selling in?
Yeah, well, yeah, I started just doing that again, talking about connection. Actually, there's sort of a one step before the four pillars, and that's there's a question that every buyer asks you. They don't ask it necessarily out loud, but they're asking it nonetheless, which is why you, right? Why should I
Hmm.
invest my time in you? Why should I trust you? Why should I take advice from you? Why should I work with you? All these questions that, if you strip out the middle words, they just end up being why you. And this sort of speaks to the power of first impressions with buyers, because first impressions are incredibly powerful. We know from science and research that when people form an impression of someone, it's very hard to change that, even when you present them with facts that contradict their perception of you. So it's really important to understand that every time you have an opportunity to interact with a buyer, it's important. There's no casual throwaway moments.
Hmm.
They all count. There's nothing too small, because, like I say, the buyer never forgets.
Hmm.
So when you think about your initial interactions with a prospective prospect, a potential prospect, are you prepared? Have you done your homework into the company, into the person? Are you prepared to be able to engage, like I said, on a human level? Just find some common ground that you can talk about, build a little bit of a personal connection that then enables you to segue into the business conversation. Takes a little work, but if you don't get a positive answer to that why you, and again, they're not going to ask it out loud, and you're not answering it verbally. It's how the buyer experiences you. So that's right at the beginning.
That makes sense. So if you can answer that question effectively, why you, and you're diving in, so you do have those four parts to the connection. Give those to the listener again, if you would.
So
And let's dig a little deeper.
connection, which we dug
Hmm.
into connection.
Yep.
Connection is just you're just forming that initial connection. That, again, I said there are voices out there say, yeah, buyers don't want relationships with sellers. Well, yeah, you're not necessarily in a relationship, but you have a relationship with your buyer just by virtue of the fact, relationship. Let's look in the dictionary. It's defined as the way two or more things are connected or work together. So if you're working with with your buyer, you have a relationship with them. Sorry to break that news to some people out there, but that's the basis set for building credibility and trust. And in the book, I have a framework, a four-pipe framework for how you build trust. It has an acronym called MICE, M-I-C-E. It's motivations transparent. Do you operate with integrity? Do you demonstrate competence? And do you execute? Meaning, do you live up to your commitments? And it's a simple framework you can use immediately in your conversations to show up differently with your buyers. But again, the important thing about the trust, and again, some people want to overlook it, is that you're one of the purposes in building this level of connection and trust with buyers is to be able to, I like to call it, stick your nose into their business. Right? If you're just doing the superficial discovery, if you're doing your superficial normal discovery questions, you're never really going to find out what's most important to the buyer. So my experience, again, personally, and working with many sellers over the years, is that in every opportunity I've worked on, there's always one thing that's more important to the buyer than everything else. Doesn't mean that there aren't a number of things that are important, but there's always one thing that's more important. And your ability to discover and understand why that is important, what that is, and why that's important to the buyer is really crucial in terms of differentiating yourself from the competition. Because to the extent you can make the buyer feel heard and understood, it's a tremendous source of value to them, and it's a differentiator.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So you've got connection. What's pillar number two?
Curiosity, which we talked about. So in the book,
Yeah.
I give six types of questions that people can use as frameworks to say, yeah, these are questions that will cause the buyer to stop and think differently about what it is they're trying to do. And that's what the purpose of questions is: help the buyer think more deeply and broadly about the problems they're encountering and the outcomes they think they can achieve. And if you can have that conversation with them, then again, you start differentiating yourself from most sellers that are out there. They're just following the standard process and asking the standard questions. And if you're asking those standard questions time and time again from the buyers, you're going to start getting rote answers to your rote questions, because we train the buyers over time. Oh yeah, that's they're going to give me their superficial questions. I'll give superficial answers. That's not going to help you. So use curiosity, 6 question types, which are again available in the book, to help the buyers think differently. And when they think differently, it's like, well, this interaction with this seller is different than it is with the other sellers. This experience is different. They're helping us in a way that no one else is. So then once you've earned that trust and you start asking these questions, you then start surfacing this information about really what's driving their decision. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I sold to a lot of large enterprises around the world, and oftentimes would be in open competitive situations, but they would narrow the field down from a dozen vendors to final 3, and they'd put together an RFP that released to the final 3 finalists. And you'd open up this RFP, and there would be these compliance matrices. Could be 300 line items long, that they wanted to know whether you complied with them or not. And you'd look at that and say, well, they can't all be equally important, right? What's the one thing that's really driving this? And that really then becomes your job as a seller. One of the most important jobs is, how do you get to that level of understanding of the thing that's most important to the buyer? Because there is one. It's there. It's just your job to find it. And so in the book, talk about how you can work the buyer through 3 stages of understanding to help them navigate that, both from the buyer, their level of understanding, and your level of understanding as a seller, to identify what this is. And then when you've identified this, what you've then identified is sort of the target, if you will. And I talk about in the book is you then collaborate with the buyer to create this vision of success. What does success look like for them if they're able to achieve this specific outcome? Well, if you're the first vendor, the first seller to be able to help the buyer buy into that vision of success, there was research that was done by, I think it was Forrester 10 years or so ago, that said, they did a study among 1,000 plus IT buyers. If you were the first vendor to get the buyer to align with your vision of success, your odds of winning the deal stood at like 60 or 65%. Well, that's huge, right? That's pretty decisive. So helping the buyer collaborate with the buyer to identify what success will look like. Well, it's that vision. If you're co-creating it with them, that vision should be aligned with your solution. So when the buyer then starts going into the market and looking more deeply at specific, products and features and functionality they need to achieve that, it's more likely to be aligned with your product you're offering than with someone else's. You've created the template for what success looks like.
Well, to get that 4th pillar of generosity in a moment, but before I do, just a friendly reminder to our live audience, we're going to get into some nice Q&A with Andy Paul here in just a moment. Some of you have begun to send us your questions. Hey, don't be bashful. Send us more. We're going to have a fantastic back and forth Q&A here in just a few minutes. So, Andy, we've got 3 of our 4 pillars we've dug a little deeper on: the connection, curiosity, understanding, generosity. Now, how does that apply to? I get that sales is about, you're making it about the other person and putting their interests first, showing curiosity, understanding what a good outcome is. But generosity, that sounds a little bit, maybe a little out of the norm to a lot of salespeople's ears. Tell us about that.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? So it's there's a way in which you give, right? Again, we're wired as human beings to be generous, to give. But there's a way to give that helps the buyer again accomplish this fundamental job they've set out to do, which is quickly gather and make sense of the information they need to make an informed decision with the least investment possible of their time, attention, and resources. And so there's a way to give that is generous. And I think, even if you look at sort of this definition of sales that I gave you before, is, job of sellers is to listen to the buyer, understand the things that are most important to them, and then help them get that. Well, just let's deconstruct that. Your job is to listen to buyers. That's a generous act, right? To listen to somebody, to understand them and the things that are most important to them. Well, that's a generous act. And then help them achieve that. Also a generous act. So that just the act of selling itself, when done well, is an act of generosity. To dig deeper in that, though, in the section of the book that I write about generosity, is a definition of value that's very specific. And I think it defines value from the perspective of the buyer. And this is something I think is really important for sellers to understand, because they always think about, well, how can I create value for the buyer? I'm giving value. And are you really? I mean, from the buyer's perspective. And so very simply, value from the perspective of the buyers is equal to progress. Meaning, if as a result of an interaction with you as a seller, Jonathan, doesn't matter what type, could be an email, voicemail, voice conversation, in-person meetings, Zoom meeting, whatever. If as a result of that interaction, I'm closer to making a decision after it than I was before, that's progress. That's value. That's value for me as the buyer. That is the fundamental definition of value in sales. So as a individual contributor or as a sales manager, if you're looking at your pipeline, you need to be able to answer two questions about every opportunity that's in there. What does the buyer need from me or from us right now in order to make progress toward making a decision? And B, having received that from us, that value from us, what steps are they willing to commit to take next? And if as a seller, you're looking at you can't answer those two questions about every opportunity in your pipeline, then we need some coaching, right? To go back and look at, hey, have we really connected? Did we answer the why
Get a
question?
little more curious, perhaps.
Well, we'll start at the beginning.
Yeah,
Do we build the trust so we can deploy our curiosity to get the deeper answers that we need? The information they just don't routinely share with everybody.
Yeah.
And do we truly understand what they're telling us? Did we confirm it? Did we, make sure that was happening? Did we, as a question I ask in the book, is just when you think you've reached a level of complete understanding of the buyer, you should always ask, well, that's okay. Just to make sure you confirm that's what great. So tell me, what are we missing? It's really powerful, right? Just when you think you've got it all tied up, you're putting a bow on it. Hold on a second. What are we missing? You'd be surprised what comes up at that point in time. Again, something that most sellers just going to glom right past, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Hey,
I like that.
What are we missing?
It demonstrates that you are really dedicated to making certain it's a great solution. You're not trying to rush to some ending that suits you. It reiterates the value with which the whole thing was begun. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Well, and it's just also we just have to get off this track that there's buyers always sort of if we've got an ICP and let's say we have 200 companies in there in our ICP and they're all pretty similar, and we think, well, they're all alike. Well, yeah, but the problem is they're not all alike in their perspective, right? I mean, excuse me, think about yourself like a medical condition. Is you think, well, no one feels this the way I do, right? I mean, maybe I've got a flu or something, and I don't know, I feel unique, right? I've got this unique perspective on how I feel. And I found this in the beginning of my sales career, that I was selling into the construction industry. And so I thought, well, they're all largely the same, they fit our criteria, our ICP, and so on. But in their perspective, they were nothing like the other people, right? They had their own unique, yeah, sure, we're sort of like them, but our problem, we're different, right? Our problems are different. Unless you understand how they think they're unique, you never really reach this level of understanding.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this has come up a lot recently in discussions about the role of AI in sales going forward. Is like, yeah, it's amazing. It's going to do a lot for sellers in take things off their plate they're doing today, maybe help them to some degree in the interaction with the buyers. But there's already been research into AI-driven systems for medical decision making. And what they found is that, the shortcomings, the way that trust started falling off with those systems with the patients, is the patient said the machine can't recognize my uniqueness.
Yeah.
And this is always going to be the case
Hmm.
with customers in B2B sales. It's going to take the human to really understand the buyer's perspective, why what they're facing, the challenges, the way they're facing their challenges, their specific problems. Yes, they're similar perhaps to other companies, but we think they're unique.
Hmm.
And when you can understand and acknowledge that uniqueness, again, you create a differentiated buying experience for the buyer.
Well, I love that. Well, speaking of uniqueness, I think you bring a unique voice, and I'm sure our listener would like to take it further. You have a really nice offer for the listener where they can do just that. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what the listener can do?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So if you want to grab a free chapter of my book, Sell Without Selling Out, Guide to Success on Your Own Terms, you can do that at my website, andypaul.com/free chapter. And I'd love to have you do that. And if another resource there, sort of free assessment, that's sort of a fun assessment, just sort of to help you gauge just how salesy you might be.
Just how salesy you might be. Might not
Yeah.
want to know. No, actually, I
Well,
think
no,
you probably
it's
do.
it's fun. It's meant to be fun,
Yeah.
and a little serious too, but meant to be fun. And
Yeah, that's good to know. There's probably some
yeah.
bad habits lingering, and even the best of us trying to update our game.
Oh,
So I love it. Well, at this
yes.
point, let's revert over to some live Q&A. I think we've got some good questions that have been asked, and let's check in with those that are into the chat here. Beginning with a friend of the show, Amy Rahovchek. She's asking, where do our sales processes, you may know Amy, where do our sales
I know.
processes get in the way of delivering a winning buying experience? And it's a really great question because, and you said at the outset, Andy, that we do have these processes by necessity. When do we get? I guess in my mind, yeah. Is this process serving you? Or are you serving the process? That there is a possible sharing there. Talk to us about that.
Well, I think that's, you sort of identified the key point is, and this is not to be blaming anybody, but there's too often managers believe the process is paramount. And that, hey, if we just follow the process, you as a seller, you're somewhat interchangeable cog in this process. Just follow the process, we'll do okay.
Hmm.
And there's been an increased emphasis on this over the last 10, 15, 20 years in sales. And what the data is showing is, actually, that's not really working, right? There was a study done in conjunction with a book that was published a year ago, called Strikingly Different Selling, that I think they surveyed 5,500 companies across multiple industry segments in the B2B space. The average win rates in B2B space, so this was for deals more in excess of 100K, but these days 100K is a pretty modest size deal.
Yeah.
Average win rate, 17%, meaning that on average, in B2B sales, sellers are closing fewer than 1 out of every 5 of their most qualified opportunities in their pipeline.
That's crazy.
Now, that's hugely problematic. And this is one of the issues I address specifically in the book that we're addressing with our cohort-based training, selling school, is there's no reason for win rates to be that low. And so what it speaks to is this mentality of sort of just playing the odds, right? If I just bring enough opportunities in my pipeline, if I'm just sort of mediocre, I can close 1 out of every 5. But we didn't get into this business to be mediocre, right? We got in this business to be the best version of ourselves.
Right.
And so as a seller, you have to ask yourself, if your personal win rate is less than 50%, if you lose more than you win, I contend that for the most part, your buyers are making the decision to buy from you in spite of you, not because of you. You don't want to be in that position. You want to be the affirmative reason why the buyer decided to buy from you and your company. And this is the challenge, and I think what happens is that too many sellers get caught up in sort of this, rote, rigid processes, and they feel that they're not empowered to sort of act in a way that's best in alignment with their own personal strengths and character and values in order to win business. And yeah, that's unfortunately enforced by many managers who, for a variety of reasons, mostly because they're not, I think, adequately trained to help develop people become the best version of themselves. And it's the part we're really missing, and that the buyers are asking for. They're asking for an experience, right, to help them make this decision, to set yourself apart from the other people. That's what they want. That's what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they don't get it, they'll buy from the machines.
Well, and unpack further what Amy's question, I think, is laying bare. I mean, if you're running a team and you're just relying on your processes, your people are probably, based on the numbers alone, you would contend, if I'm hearing you right, on numbers alone, they're underperforming because they're not really pushing for a qualitative outcome that is really based on these sound principles you've been talking about. You're just letting the process carry most of the day. And I think
Well,
that this is really what you seem to be issuing as a challenge to, no. There's way more to it than that. And the numbers, if your process is yielding these numbers, then the process is broken and you're relying on it with too much focus, it sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah. So here's a very simple way to look at it. The buyer has a vote, right, to buy from you or not. Your win rate is the reflection of their vote about you and the experience of working with you as a seller. It's just, it's not personal, so to speak. It's just, it is what it is. And so if, they vote the majority of the time, or in the case of this, this research, is more than 80% of the time they're voting that experience was negative.
Yeah.
What's that say about the future of this profession?
Right. Let's get into something a little more tactical. We got a great question here from Tucky Steele. What's the best way to approach the buyer to get to that first meeting without making them feel you're trying to sell them something? There are KPIs. There's expectations that your manager has of you. You're a producer on the front lines. You can kind of feel the pain of a guy like Tucky, right? How do you maybe get in touch with yourself enough to be authentic at the front end? Do you have some tips for him?
Yeah. So, there's, it's never been, I wouldn't say easier, but I'll use that word and I'll qualify it in just a second. In a sense, to get in touch with people that you want to have conversations with, because we have this incredible platform, LinkedIn, right? Now,
I've heard of that.
Yeah, LinkedIn
Sounds familiar.
Sort of like email. It's people are bombarded. Their inboxes are incredibly busy. They're noisy. But unlike with email, with LinkedIn, you have this opportunity to connect in a way that is more authentic, right? And now we go into sort of a long story about how you set yourself up for that. I mean, part of that is you have to, as a individual contributor, I'm a huge believer that you also have to be sort of a content creator these days, that you have to create a brand around yourself. You have to have a point of view. So we know that 80 from Research on the Rain Group said that 82% of buyers look at a seller's profile before they speak with them for the first time. Assume that number's it's high enough. Just assume it's 100%, right?
Yeah.
So what are they seeing when they go to your profile? What is it that speaks to them to say, look, this person is worth investing my time and attention in? Do you have something to say that speaks to the challenges that they're facing? Right. And it's not just purely sharing marketing content from put out by your marketing department. What do you think? Because they're having the conversation with you. So that's one element of it, is you have to be prepared to start building this brand of you as a seller, because people are judging you based on that. And then secondly, it's just in your outreach, what's going to work for you? What works is, it's part of it's like finding your voice in terms of the ways that the words that you want to use, the ways you want to connect, that will resonate with someone in an authentic way, and do it in a way that's giving and not taking, right? If anybody on this session, I'm sure has experienced somebody reaching out to them on LinkedIn, hey, I want to connect. And then within 15 seconds, there's a automated response, trying to sell you something. Don't do that. right? Defy
Hmm.
people's expectations about what's going to happen.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, what starts with sharing? What are you sharing that might be of value to them?
Hmm.
And maybe you have to share for a long time before you take the initiative, say, is it worth talking? Right? Maybe it's
Hmm.
not just one outreach, maybe it's 5 outreaches.
Hmm.
Find out, experiment, find out what works
Hmm.
and what works for you, right? Because what may be working for the person sitting next to you is completely different.
Hmm.
And you can't judge yourself by that. It's too easy to get sort of nervous saying, "Oh, well, guys, this person's having such great success reaching out, and I'm seemingly not." It's like, no. What the only thing that matters at the end of the day is uh, we're able to win a deal. We're able to help the buyer make a great decision,
Yeah.
and the way you do it is going to be distinct and unique to you. So you have to experiment and find out what works.
It sounds kind of like Taki may be relying too much on process, if I may say. And I think you're getting a friendly challenge from Andy Taki to take more of this on you, right? And be more
Yeah,
authentic and engage with
experiment.
some of the process we've been talking about. I love it.
So the great American author Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "All life is an experiment. The more experiments you make, the better." And I
Yeah,
absolutely, it couldn't be more true for sales.
I love it. Got a question from Mitchell, and he asked, "What is one thing you believe, Andy, about sales that is not or would not be accepted by most sales leaders?" Take it away.
Where do I start? Um, well, just let's talk about one thing that we just talked about here today, which is win rates.
Mm.
It is it's amazing because we run these. We with my partners, Amy Rohovchak and Meg Mishak, we run Selling School, which is cohort-based course we talked about that teach the principles of selling in, and it's focused on increasing win rates.
Mm.
That is the metric we focus on. And so when students come into the course, I'm always sort of amazed as how few actually know their win rates.
Hmm.
And on top of that, their managers aren't tracking it.
Mm.
It's like, well, no, this is the metric, right? Sure, we need to have activity. We need to track our activity because sales is at some point a numbers game, inescapable.
Hmm.
But the number that matters the most is what's the buyer think of the experience working with you, and that's what's reflected in the win rate.
Yeah.
And you have control over that,
Hmm.
right? I mean, we don't have control of our product. We don't have control over the pricing. We don't have control over features. I have control over how I act with the buyer.
Hmm.
And I'm not going to win every deal, but I need to be able to get to a position where I can win more than I lose.
Yeah, I love that. Dennis has a great question for us as well. And it's kind of a comment with a question. How many salespeople we've known that literally happen to sell in spite of themselves? There's a lot of truth in that. Maybe you have a great that good of a process, or you're just in a good hot market. Some of this could be a function of training. I agree with Dennis. His question is, what do you do when folks aren't coachable? I think that's a really great question. Do you
It is.
think is this like? As a leader, what's your decision-making process with the team? When's it time to maybe rotate someone in or out of your team? Talk to us about that, Andy.
A kind way you're saying that, of rotating them, uh,
Rotated, yeah, yeah,
coaching them to a different opportunity.
right.
No, Dennis is really identified, and I think that's something you want to interview for, right? When you're interviewing people, is
Mm.
are they coachable? I mean, this is one of the most critical things because if you can bring someone on the team that maybe has potential but they aren't coachable, they're never going to achieve at the level that they think they should. They're never going to achieve at the level that you think that they should, and so you're going to have that mismatch.
Mm.
I think coachability is one of the key characteristics that you screen for when you interview. I remember interviewing Mark Roberge, who was one of the founding VP of sales or CRO at HubSpot on my podcast, and he talked about how that specifically when they interviewed people, they'd have people sort of do a sample presentation. They give them a few minutes to prepare a presentation and come in and make the pitch to them, and then they would provide feedback and ask the person to go away and prepare for a few minutes, come back and represent.
Hmm.
And what they're looking for is, did they take the coaching?
Mm.
And I think it's just a great thing. I recommend it to companies as well. Is when you're interviewing people, you want to test the things that are really important to you,
Yeah.
and the things you think are critical skills for the job. And if being coachable is one of them, test it. And
Hmm.
I think for most managers it should be.
I love that. I think that's such a great note to end on. Well, Andy, Paul, thank you so much for adding so much value to the show. A lot of
Thanks,
great
Jonathan.
insights today. I want to encourage everyone who's listening, go get yourself the book. At minimum, go to the website and get those free resources. Andy has a lot of fantastic IP. But on behalf of the Overpass team and our listenership here, Andy, thanks for being such a fantastic guest today.
Oh, Jonathan, thank you for having me. It's been so much fun. Great
It has
conversation.
been. Yeah, absolute ball. Well, and if you've been enjoying the guests we've been having on the show, you can go check out our previous guests anytime you like by going and checking out the Evolve Sales Leader podcast, wherever you like to get podcasts. We've got this re-edited into a form you can download during your workouts, listen to while you're in the drive time, what have you. Check out the Evolve Sales Leader podcast. And also a friendly reminder, we are powered by Overpass. If you need to rotate somebody into or out of your team, there's no better place to get some fresh, fantastic new talent on your team quickly than overpass.com. It's free to use to hiring managers. Jump over there, create your free account at overpass.com. That's going to do it for today. Thanks everybody for listening and making the Evolve Sales Leader such a successful show. We'll see you next time, same station. See you then. Bye-bye now.